A first-class revolt against the accepted American order was certainly taking place during those early years of the post-war decade, but it was one with which Nikolai Lenin had nothing whatever to do. The shock troops of the rebellion were not alien agitators, but the sons and daughters of well-to-do American families, who knew little about Bolshevism and cared distinctly less, and their defiance was expressed not in obscure radical publications or in soapbox speeches, but right across the family breakfast table into the horrified ears of conservative fathers and mothers. Men and women were still shivering at the Red Menace when they awoke to the no less alarming problem of the younger generation, and realized that if the Constitution were not in danger, the moral code of the country certainly was. This code, as it currently concerned young people, might have been roughly summarized as follows. Women were the guardians of morality. They were made of finer stuff than men and were expected to act accordingly. Young girls must look forward in innocence tempered perhaps with a modicum of physiological instruction to a romantic love match which would lead them to the altar and to living happily ever after. And until the right man came along, they must allow no male to kiss them. It was expected that some men would succumb to the temptations of sex, but only with a special class of outlawed women. Girls of respectable families were supposed to have no such temptations. Boys and girls were permitted large freedom to work and play together, with decreasing and well-nigh nominal chaperonage, but only because the code worked so well on the whole that a sort of honor system was supplanting supervision by their elders. It was taken for granted that if they had been well brought up, they would never take advantage of this freedom. And although the attitude towards smoking and drinking by girls differed widely in different strata of society in different parts of the country, majority opinion held that it was morally wrong for them to smoke and could hardly imagine them showing the effects of alcohol. The war had not long been over when cries of alarm from parents, teachers, and moral preceptors began to rend the air. For the boys and girls just growing out of adolescence were making mincemeat of this code. The dresses that the girls, and for that matter most of the older women, were wearing seemed alarming enough. In July 1920, a fashion writer reported in the New York Times that the American woman has lifted her skirts far beyond any modest limitation, which was another way of saying that the hem was now all of 9 inches above the ground. It was freely predicted that skirts would come down again in the winter of 1920 to 21. But instead they climbed a few scandalous inches farther. The flappers wore thin dresses, short-sleeved and occasionally, in the evening, sleeveless. Some of the wilder young things rolled their stockings below their knees, revealing to the shocked eyes of virtue a fleeting glance of shin bones and kneecap, and many of them were visibly using cosmetics. The intoxication of rouge, earnestly explained Dorothy Spear in Dancers in the Dark, is an insidious vintage known to more girls than mere man can ever believe. Useless for frantic parents to insist that no lady did such things. The answer was that the daughters of ladies were doing it, and even retouching their masterpieces in public. Some of them, furthermore, were abandoning their corsets. The men won't dance with you if you wear a corset, they were quoted as saying. The current mode in dancing created still more consternation. Not the romantic violin, but the barbaric saxophone now dominated the orchestra, and to its passionate crooning and wailing the foxtrotters moved in what the editor of the Hobart College Herald disgustedly called a syncopated embrace. No longer did even an inch of space separate them. They danced as if glued together, body to body, cheek to cheek. Cried the Catholic Telegraph of Cincinnati in righteous indignation, the music is sensuous, the embracing of partners, the female only half-dressed, is absolutely indecent, and the motions, they are such as may not be described with any respect for propriety in a family newspaper. Suffice it to say that there are certain houses appropriate for such dances, but those houses have been closed by law. Supposedly nice girls were smoking cigarettes, openly and defiantly, if often rather awkwardly and self-consciously. They were drinking, somewhat less openly, but often all too efficaciously. There were stories of daughters of the most exemplary parents getting drunk, blotto, as their companions cheerfully put it, on the contents of the hip flasks of the new prohibition regime, and going out joyriding with men at 4 a.m. And worst of all, even at well-regulated dances, they were said to retire where the eye of the most sharp-sighted chaperone could not follow, and in darkened rooms or in parked cars to engage in the unspeakable practice of petting and necking. It was not until F. Scott Fitzgerald, who had hardly graduated from Princeton and ought to know what his generation was doing, brought out This Side of Paradise in April 1920, that fathers and mothers realized fully what was afoot, and how long it had been going on. Apparently, the petting party had been current as early as 1916, and was now widely established as an indoor sport. None of the Victorian mothers, and most of the mothers were Victorian, had any idea how casually their daughters were accustomed to be kissed, wrote Mr. Fitzgerald. Amory saw girls doing things that even in his memory would have been impossible, eating 3 o'clock, after-dance suppers in impossible cafes, talking of every side of life with an air, half of earnestness, half of mockery, yet with a furtive excitement that Amory considered stood for a real moral letdown. But he never realized how widespread it was until he saw the cities between New York and Chicago as one vast juvenile intrigue. The book caused a shudder to run down the national spine. Did not Mr. Fitzgerald represent one of his well-nurtured heroines as brazenly confessing, "I've kissed dozens of men, I suppose I'll kiss dozens more," and another heroine as saying to a young man, "Oh, just 1 person in 50 has any glimmer of what sex is. I'm hipped on Freud and all that, but it's rotten that every bit of real love in the world is 99% passion and one little soupçon of jealousy." It was incredible. It was abominable. What did it all mean? Was every decent standard being thrown over? Mothers read the scarlet words and wondered if they themselves had any idea how often their daughters were accustomed to be kissed. But no, this must be an exaggerated account of the misconduct of some especially depraved group. Nice girls couldn't behave like that and talk openly about passion, but in due course, other books appeared to substantiate the findings of Mr. Fitzgerald: Dancers in the Dark, The Plastic Age, Flaming Youth. Magazine articles and newspapers reiterated the scandal. To be sure, there were plenty of communities where nice girls did not, in actual fact, behave like that. And even in the more sophisticated urban centers, there were plenty of girls who did not. Nevertheless, there was enough fire beneath the smoke of these sensational revelations to make the problem of the younger generation a topic of anxious discussion from coast to coast. The forces of morality rallied to the attack. Dr. Francis E. Clark, the founder and president of the Christian Endeavor Society, declared that the modern indecent dance was an offense against womanly purity, the very fountainhead of our family and civil life. The new style of dancing was denounced in religious journals as impure, polluting, corrupting, debasing, destroying spirituality, increasing carnality. And the mothers and sisters and church members of the land were called upon to admonish and instruct and raise the spiritual tone of these dreadful young people. President Murphy of the University of Florida cried out with true Southern warmth, "The low-cut gowns, the rolled hose, and short skirts are born of the devil and his angels, and are carrying the present and future generations to chaos and destruction." A group of Episcopal churchwomen in New York, speaking with the authority of wealth and social position, for they included Mrs. J. Pierpont Morgan, Mrs. Borden Harriman, Mrs. Henry Phipps, Mrs. James Roosevelt, and Mrs. E. H. Harriman, proposed an organization to discourage fashions involving an excess of nudity and improper ways of dancing. The YWCA conducted a national campaign against immodest dress among high school girls, supplying newspapers with printed matter carrying headlines such as "Working Girls Responsive to Modesty Appeal," and "High Heels Losing Ground Even in France." In Philadelphia, a dress reform committee of prominent citizens sent a questionnaire to over 1,000 clergymen to ask them what would be their idea of a proper dress. And although the gentlemen of the cloth showed a distressing variety of opinion, the committee proceeded to design a moral gown, which was endorsed by ministers of 15 denominations. The distinguishing characteristics of this moral gown were that it was very loose-fitting, that the sleeves reached just below the elbows, and that the hem came within 7.5 inches of the floor. Not content with example and reproof, legislators in several states introduced bills to reform feminine dress once and for all. The New York American reported in 1921 that a bill was pending in Utah providing fine and imprisonment for those who wore on the streets skirts higher than 3 inches above the ankle. A bill was laid before the Virginia legislature which would forbid any woman from wearing shirtwaists or evening gowns which displayed more than 3 inches of her throat. In Ohio, the proposed limit of décolletage was 2 inches. The bill introduced in the Ohio legislature aimed also to prevent the sale of any garment which unduly displays or accentuates the lines of the female figure, and to prohibit any female over 14 years of age from wearing a skirt which does not reach to that part of the foot known as the instep. Meanwhile, innumerable families were torn with dissension over cigarettes and gin and all-night automobile rides. Fathers and mothers lay awake asking themselves whether their children were not utterly lost. Sons and daughters evaded questions, lied miserably and unhappily, or flared up to reply rudely that at least they were not dirty-minded hypocrites, that they saw no harm in what they were doing, and proposed to go right on doing it. From those liberal clergymen and teachers who prided themselves on keeping step with all that was new came a chorus of reassurance. These young people were at least franker and more honest than their elders had been. Having experimented for themselves, would they not soon find out which standards were outworn and which represented the accumulated moral wisdom of the race? Hearing such hopeful words, many good people took heart again. Perhaps this flare-up of youthful passion was a flash in the pan after all. Perhaps in another year or two, the boys and girls would come to their senses and everything would be all right again. They were wrong, however, for the revolt of the younger generation was only the beginning of a revolution in manners and morals that was already beginning to affect men and women of every age in every part of the country.